What would you do if your own mind started betraying you? Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. You forget things, small at first, then bigger, until you're not even sure what's real anymore. The doctors say it's stress. Your husband says he'll take care of everything, and you want to believe him because he's the only thing that still feels real. But then you collapse again, and this time something inside you whispers, "This isn't normal." That night, your phone lights up. One message, no name, no number. You're not sick, you're being poisoned. So tell me, if you can't trust your own memory, would you trust the person standing right next to you? A thin layer of rain taps softly against the tall glass windows of Emily Parker's apartment. The city outside blurred into streaks of gold and gray beneath the streetlights, the night heavy and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily Parker had never been afraid of anything in her life, until she started becoming afraid of herself. She stood in the middle of her living room, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, staring at the notebook in her hands as if it belonged to someone else. The handwriting was hers, clean, precise, controlled, but the words felt distant, detached, like they had been written by a version of her she could no longer reach. Call investor back. Reschedule board meeting. Daniel said I forgot lunch again. She didn't remember writing any of it. Emily was 34, tall and composed, with a quiet confidence that had always made people listen when she spoke. Her dark brown hair rested neatly against her shoulders, slightly damp from the rain earlier, and her hazel eyes, once sharp and decisive, now carried a flicker of something unfamiliar: doubt. She had built her life on clarity, on control, on the ability to make decisions others couldn't. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. So why did it feel like someone was slowly erasing her? The first time she fainted, it had been in a boardroom full of executives. She had been mid-sentence, explaining a strategy she knew by heart, when the room shifted slightly, just enough to feel wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just off. Then everything went dark. When she woke up, Daniel's voice was the first thing she heard, steady and calm, cutting through the noise like an anchor. Everyone said it was stress. She accepted it because she needed it to be true. The second time happened in her car. One moment she was driving, focused, present. The next, her thoughts unraveled into silence. When she came back, the car was idling at the curb, her hands still gripping the wheel, her heart racing as if she had narrowly escaped something she couldn't remember. She told herself it was exhaustion. It had to be. The third time broke something inside her. It was dinner. Just the two of them, candlelight reflecting softly in the glass between them. Daniel Reed sat across from her, watching her with that same composed, reassuring presence he always had. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with a strong, structured face that carried both authority and calm. His dark hair was always neatly styled, his posture effortless but controlled, and there was a quiet steadiness in the way he moved that made people instinctively trust him. His blue eyes never rushed, never pressured. They simply stayed, grounding, patient. Daniel wasn't just her husband. He was the one constant in a world that suddenly felt unstable. She remembered lifting her glass. She remembered his voice, soft, asking if she was okay. Then nothing. When she woke up, she was in bed, the lights dimmed, Daniel sitting beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. "You just need rest," he said, his voice low and certain. "You've been carrying too much for too long." And Emily believed him. She wanted to believe him. Because if she didn't, then what explanation was left? Now alone in the quiet apartment, she pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to hold her thoughts together. They felt thin, fragile, like something worn down over time. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "I'm just tired," she whispered. "That's all this is." For a brief moment, she almost believed it. She walked toward the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, forcing herself to breathe normally. She could fix this. She just needed rest. A break. Time. That was all. Then her eyes drifted back to the notebook, and the illusion cracked, because no matter how tired she was, she would remember writing her own thoughts. What terrified her wasn't the idea of being sick, it was the possibility that everything she had built, her decisions, her leadership, her identity, had all depended on a mind that was now slipping away. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just about her health. This was about everything. Her company, her responsibilities, her future. Daniel. The thought of him hit her harder than anything else. He had been there for every moment, every collapse, every piece of confusion she couldn't explain. He never lost patience, never raised his voice, never made her feel weak. He simply stepped in, quietly, seamlessly, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And that terrified her, because if she kept getting worse, then one day he wouldn't be helping her. He would be carrying her. "I can't do that to him," she whispered, her voice breaking. Emily had never been the kind of person who depended on others. She was the one people depended on, the one who fixed problems, who held things together, who made the hard decisions when no one else could. And now, she couldn't even trust her own memory. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm not losing myself," she said quietly, like saying it out loud could make it true. But the doubt was already there, and it was growing. The apartment fell into silence again, heavy and suffocating. Emily stood there, caught between denial and something much darker, something she didn't want to name. Then, her phone vibrated. The sound cut through the room, sharp and immediate. Emily didn't move. Something inside her stilled, like a warning she couldn't explain. She turned slowly toward the coffee table, where her phone lit up in the dim room, the glow cold against the darkness. For a few seconds, she just stared at it, because somehow she already knew. Whatever was on that screen wouldn't make things better. She stepped closer, her heart beat louder now, her fingers hovering just above the device before finally picking it up. Unknown number, a single message. No name, no context, just one line. "You're not sick, you're being poisoned." Emily's first instinct was rejection. This had to be wrong, a prank, a scam, someone trying to manipulate her. Because the alternative was impossible. Her grip tightened around the phone, her pulse racing as the words echoed in her mind, colliding with everything she had been trying to hold together. Poisoned? That didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Because if it did, then this wasn't something happening inside her. Someone was doing this. And there was only one person who had been there every single time. Emily's breath grew uneven, her eyes still locked on the screen as the silence around her deepened. For the first time since all of this began, she wasn't just afraid of losing herself anymore. She was afraid of what the truth might take away from her if she chose to face it. Emily didn't sleep that night. Not really. Not in any way that felt like rest, because every time she closed her eyes, the words from the message resurfaced with a clarity that cut through everything else. "You're not sick. You're being poisoned." By morning, she had already convinced herself it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, because the alternative required her to question the only person who had been steady through all of this, and Emily wasn't ready to destroy the last piece of certainty she had left. She sat at the edge of the bed, sunlight slipping through the curtains in thin, quiet lines, her phone still in her hand, as if letting go of it would somehow make the message disappear, her thoughts looping between logic and fear in a way that left her exhausted before the day even began. Daniel Reed appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, already dressed, already composed, as if nothing in the world had shifted overnight. He leaned lightly against the frame before stepping in, his movements calm, controlled, every gesture measured in a way that made him feel reliable, almost unshakable. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used every time she came back from one of her episodes, never alarmed, never rushed, always exactly what she needed to hear. Up close, there was something about him that made doubt feel unreasonable, the sharp structure of his face softened by a careful warmth, his blue eyes focused entirely on her, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Emily looked at him for a moment longer than usual, searching without meaning to, but finding nothing out of place, nothing that matched the darkness her mind had tried to build the night before. "I didn't sleep much," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone before she set it face down on the nightstand, hiding it not from him, but from herself. Daniel crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the familiar steadiness of him, the quiet presence that had anchored her through every moment she couldn't explain. "That's okay," he said, reaching for her hand without hesitation, his thumb brushing across her skin in the same slow rhythm she had come to associate with safety. "Your body's been under a lot of pressure. It's catching up." There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation, and Emily felt something inside her ease just slightly, like a tension she hadn't realized she was holding beginning to loosen. She nodded, because that explanation made sense, because it was simple, because it didn't require her to tear apart everything she believed about her life. "I think I just need a few days," she said, more to convince herself than him, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't demand anything, didn't push, only reassured. "Then take them," he replied. "The company will survive without you for a week." There was a softness in the way he said it, but also something else, something practical, grounded, as if he had already considered this outcome long before she had. Later that morning, Emily forced herself back into a version of routine, not because she felt capable, but because she needed to prove that she still could. She sat at her desk in the home office, the space meticulously organized the way she always preferred, clean lines, neutral tones, everything in its place, except now it felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room she used to own but no longer fully understood. Her laptop was open, emails waiting, decisions pending, but as she scanned the screen, a strange hesitation crept in, subtle but persistent, like her mind was buffering in places it never had before. She reached for her notebook instead, flipping through the pages, grounding herself in the one thing she had started to rely on. But even that brought no comfort, only more evidence of the gap she couldn't explain. Her phone buzzed again, softer this time, pulling her attention back with a quiet insistence that made her chest tighten. For a second, she froze, her eyes fixed on the screen without touching it, as if she could delay whatever it was just by not acknowledging it. But it wasn't the same number. This time, it was familiar. Sophie Parker. Emily exhaled slowly before answering, pressing the phone to her ear as she leaned back in her chair. "Hey," she said, forcing a steadiness she didn't quite feel. Sophie's voice came through immediately, quick, slightly sharp around the edges, but not unkind, just direct in a way that had always defined her. Sophie was 2 years younger, shorter than Emily by several inches, with a lean frame and restless energy that made her seem like she was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Her light brown hair was usually pulled into a loose ponytail, never perfectly styled, and her green eyes carried a kind of alertness that missed very little. Unlike Emily, Sophie didn't trust easily, and once, years ago, that had led her into a business partnership that ended badly, shaping her into someone who questioned everything before accepting it. "I heard you collapsed again," Sophie said without preamble, her tone direct but laced with concern she didn't try to hide. Emily closed her eyes briefly, leaning her head back against the chair. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the same answer she had given everyone else, the same answer she wasn't entirely sure she believed. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that meant Sophie wasn't convinced. "You don't sound fine," she said, quieter now, more measured. "Have you actually talked to a specialist? Not just general tests?" Emily hesitated, just for a second, her gaze drifting to the notebook again. "They said it's stress," she answered, and even as she said it, the words felt thinner than they had yesterday. Sophie exhaled audibly. "That's not a diagnosis, Emily. That's what they say when they don't know." The bluntness should have annoyed her, but instead it settled somewhere deeper, because a small part of her had been thinking the same thing. "I'm handling it," Emily said, more firmly this time, as if reinforcing the idea could make it true. "Daniel's helping. I'm taking time off." There was another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. "Of course he is," Sophie replied, and something in her tone shifted, not quite distrust, but not blind acceptance either. "Just be careful, okay? Don't sign anything, don't make big decisions until you know what's going on." The words landed harder than they should have. Emily straightened slightly in her chair. "Why would I?" she started, but stopped herself, because the answer was already there. Because Daniel had already mentioned it. Because the idea had already been planted. "It's just temporary," she said instead, softer now, almost defensive. "He's just trying to help." "I'm sure he is," Sophie said, but this time there was something behind it, something unspoken. "Just don't let anyone take control of your life while you're not at your best. You've worked too hard for that." After the call ended, the silence in the room felt different. Not heavier, not darker, but sharper, like something had shifted just enough to make everything slightly out of alignment. Emily stared at the desk in front of her, her thoughts circling in a way that felt dangerously close to clarity. She wanted to trust Daniel. She needed to trust him. Because if she didn't, then everything started to fall apart. Her gaze drifted slowly toward the bedroom door, where he had stood just hours earlier, calm, steady, unwavering. And for a moment, just a moment, the message from the night before didn't feel impossible anymore. Emily didn't go looking for the truth that day. It found her in the quietest, most ordinary way possible, buried inside a file she wasn't supposed to open, hidden among documents that should have meant nothing, but suddenly meant everything. The home office felt colder than usual. The neat arrangement of folders and digital files no longer comforting but clinical, like a place where things were recorded, not understood. And as she sat in front of her laptop, her fingers hesitated just long enough to suggest that some part of her already knew she was about to cross a line she couldn't come back from. It started with something small, something almost insignificant, a legal notification tucked into an archived email thread, referencing a name she didn't recognize at first, Laura Mitchell, attached to a case file that had been closed years ago, long before Emily had entered Daniel's life, long before any of this had begun. She clicked on it without thinking, or maybe because she couldn't stop thinking, and the moment the document opened, something inside her shifted in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The file was dense, formal, filled with legal language that demanded attention. But her eyes moved quickly, instinctively searching for something that felt human, something that would make sense. Laura Mitchell, 32 at the time of filing, married, diagnosed with cognitive decline and impaired decision-making capacity. Emily leaned back slightly, her breath catching as she read the words again, slower this time, as if reading them carefully might somehow change them. Cognitive decline, impaired capacity. The same phrases the doctors had used with her, the same vague explanations that had sounded reasonable until they didn't. There was a photograph embedded in the file, slightly grainy but clear enough to hold her attention longer than anything else. Laura Mitchell had been beautiful in a quiet, understated way, the kind of beauty that didn't demand attention but stayed with you once you noticed it. She had long blonde hair that fell loosely around her shoulders, pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the light, and soft gray-blue eyes that carried something fragile, something distant, as if she was already beginning to slip away even before the photograph had been taken. Her posture in the image was slightly withdrawn, shoulders drawn in just enough to suggest discomfort, or uncertainty, or perhaps something deeper that no one had bothered to name. Emily found herself staring at the photo longer than she should have, searching for something familiar, something that would explain why her chest felt tight, why her hands had started to grow cold. It wasn't just sympathy, it wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. She scrolled further. The documents detailed the progression of Laura's condition in a way that felt disturbingly structured, almost predictable. Episodes of disorientation, memory lapses, increasing dependence on her spouse for daily decisions. Emily's heart began to race, not because the information was shocking, but because it wasn't. It was familiar. Too familiar. Each line she read felt less like a discovery and more like a reflection, a mirror she hadn't realized she was standing in front of until it was too late to look away. She began to forget routine tasks. She showed signs of confusion during professional interactions. She required supervision in matters of financial judgment. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the desk. No, this could still be coincidence. People get sick. Conditions repeat. Symptoms overlap. That was normal. That had to be normal. But then she reached the legal section. The language shifted there, becoming colder, more precise, stripped of anything that resembled concern. Petition for transfer of financial authority. Request for legal guardianship. Spouse Daniel Reed listed as primary petitioner. Emily stopped breathing for a second as the name settled into place, no longer abstract, no longer separate from her reality. Daniel. Her Daniel. The man who sat beside her when she woke up, who held her hand when she felt like she was losing control, who spoke with such certainty that it made doubt feel unnecessary. Her stomach twisted. The documents continued, outlining the approval process, the court's acceptance of the medical evaluation, the final decision granting Daniel full control over Laura Mitchell's financial and legal affairs. It was all there, structured, validated, official. Clean. Too clean. Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes unfocused for a moment as her mind tried to reorganize what she had just seen into something that made sense. There had to be context she was missing. Something that explained why this felt wrong when it shouldn't. Daniel had never mentioned Laura. Not once. Not in passing, not as history, not as anything. Why? Her gaze drifted back to the photograph. Laura's eyes. There was something in them. Not just fragility. Fear. A quiet, contained fear that didn't scream, didn't demand attention, but sat just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice. Emily's chest tightened again. "Stop," she whispered under her breath, pressing her fingers lightly against her temple as if she could interrupt the direction her thoughts were taking. This was dangerous. This kind of thinking, jumping to conclusions, connecting unrelated things, that was exactly what someone with a neurological issue would do. That was what the doctors had warned about. That was what Daniel had been helping her manage. Right? She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, forcing herself to reset. When she opened them again, she looked back at the screen, but this time she tried to see it differently, more rationally, more objectively. Laura had been sick. The court had acted based on medical evidence. Daniel had stepped in because someone had to. That was what people did when the person they loved could no longer take care of themselves. That was what he was doing for her now. The thought settled for a moment, fragile but possible. Then she scrolled again. There were timestamps. Dates. Laura's symptoms had escalated rapidly within a short period. Weeks, not years. A sharp decline that didn't follow the gradual pattern Emily had always associated with neurological conditions. It was sudden, aggressive, efficient. Emily's throat went dry. Her own symptoms had started. Recently. Too recently. Her hand moved almost unconsciously to the notebook beside her, flipping it open, scanning the entries she had written over the past few days. The gaps, the confusion, the increasing frequency. It lined up. Not perfectly, but enough. "That doesn't mean anything," she said quietly, her voice tight now, less convincing than before. "It doesn't mean it's the same." But the doubt had already found its place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't overwhelming. It was precise, targeted, and it didn't go away. Emily closed the file slowly, her finger hovering over the trackpad for a second longer than necessary before she finally shut the screen. The room felt different now, the same space but altered, like something invisible had shifted just enough to make everything feel slightly off. The neat arrangement of her office no longer reassured her. It reminded her of structure, of control, of systems that could be used to organize not just information, but people. She stood up, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she needed to be careful now, not because of what she knew, but because of what she didn't. Laura Mitchell hadn't disappeared overnight. She had faded, step by step, documented, approved, explained. Emily walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, layered over the blurred city beyond. For a moment, she studied it, not with recognition, but with uncertainty. Am I looking at myself, or at what comes next? Her phone buzzed again on the desk behind her, but she didn't turn around immediately. She wasn't ready for another message, another voice, another piece of information that might push her further in a direction she was still resisting. Because if this wasn't a coincidence, if this wasn't just bad timing, then she wasn't just getting sick, she was following a path, and someone had already walked it before her. And for the first time since she met Daniel, trust no longer felt automatic. It felt like a choice, and she wasn't sure she could make it the same way anymore. Alex Carter had never believed in coincidences, not the kind that repeated themselves with the same precision, the same structure, the same quiet efficiency that made everything look clean on paper and devastating in reality. He sat alone in his office late at night, the only light coming from a row of monitors casting a cold glow across the room. His posture relaxed, but his attention razor sharp, the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, but from control. Alex was 38, tall and lean with a build that suggested strength without effort, his dark hair cut short but slightly unkempt in a way that made him look less polished than the world he operated in. And his face carried a quiet intensity, sharpened by a light stubble that framed his jaw, giving him an edge that people either trusted immediately or avoided entirely. His eyes, dark, observant, and impossibly focused, rarely missed anything, and that had been both his greatest advantage and the reason he no longer believed in simple explanations. Years ago, before Emily Parker had ever heard Daniel Reed's name, Alex had come across Laura Mitchell's case, not as a headline, but as a discrepancy, a pattern buried inside financial records that didn't align the way they should have. It hadn't been dramatic, no sudden red flags, no obvious crime. Just small inconsistencies, accounts shifting ownership too cleanly, legal transitions happening too quickly, medical conclusions appearing too definitive for something as unpredictable as cognitive decline. At the time, Alex had been working independently, consulting on financial irregularities for private clients, a field he had entered after leaving a corporate investigation unit where his refusal to overlook minor anomalies had made him difficult to keep. He had built his reputation not on speed, but on persistence, on the ability to sit with a problem long enough until it revealed what it was trying to hide. Laura Mitchell had been one of those problems. He had followed her case quietly, tracing the timeline backward, reconstructing what had happened from fragments rather than statements. Laura's life had not collapsed overnight, but it hadn't deteriorated naturally either. The progression was too contained, too controlled, as if every stage had been guided just enough to remain believable. And at the center of it all had been Daniel Reed, her husband, her legal representative, the man who had ultimately been granted full authority over everything she owned. Alex had never proven anything, but he had never stopped watching. When Emily Parker's name first appeared in Daniel's financial orbit, it hadn't raised immediate alarms. Emily was successful, established, someone who wouldn't easily be manipulated, and for a moment, Alex had assumed Daniel had moved on from whatever pattern he had once suspected. But then the signals started to repeat. Subtle shifts in account access, legal consultations that mirrored the structure of Laura's case, quiet movements that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed something disturbingly familiar. And then Emily's medical reports surfaced. Alex leaned back slightly in his chair as he pulled them up again, scanning through the language that had bothered him from the beginning. Neurological fatigue, cognitive impairment, stress-induced decline. The same words, the same tone, the same careful vagueness that allowed for interpretation while suggesting certainty. He exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the desk as his gaze moved between Emily's file and Laura's, the parallels aligning in a way that no longer allowed him to dismiss them. "It's the same," he muttered under his breath, not with surprise but with confirmation. But Emily was different. That was the problem. Laura had been isolated early, her professional connections severed as her condition progressed, her world shrinking until Daniel became her primary point of reference. Emily, on the other hand, still had structure, influence, people who depended on her, and that made the situation more volatile. If Daniel was repeating the same pattern, he would have to move faster, more carefully, more precisely. Which meant Emily didn't have time. Alex reached for his phone, scrolling through a series of images he had taken over the past few days, each one time-stamped, each one part of a larger puzzle he had been assembling piece by piece. One of them stopped him, a frame captured from across the street, taken through the reflection of glass, subtle enough to avoid attention, but clear enough to show what mattered. Daniel Reed, standing in the kitchen. Emily's apartment, his hand moving just slightly, just enough. A small vial, a controlled motion, pouring. Alex had watched the footage more times than he cared to admit, not because he needed to confirm what he had seen, but because he needed to understand how easily it had been done. No hesitation, no rush, just routine. That was what unsettled him the most. This wasn't impulsive. This was practiced. He had considered going to the authorities, more than once. But evidence like this, without context, without a chain that connected it directly to harm, would raise questions he couldn't answer yet. And Daniel was careful enough to stay just within the boundaries of doubt. Emily wouldn't be believed, not yet. Alex placed the phone back on the desk, his jaw tightening slightly as he shifted his focus to a different set of data. Financial transfers, shell accounts, patterns of movement that extended beyond Daniel himself. This wasn't just about control over a spouse's assets. The scale was larger. Money was being moved, redistributed, layered in ways that suggested coordination, not isolation. Daniel wasn't acting alone. That realization had come slowly, but once it did, everything else began to make more sense. The speed of Laura's case, the efficiency of the legal approvals, the absence of resistance. Systems had been in place to support it, to smooth the process, to ensure nothing raised enough concern to stop it. And now, Emily was inside that system. Alex leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he pulled up a new file, one that connected Daniel to a private legal consultant named Richard Hale. Hale was in his mid-50s, with a reputation built on discretion rather than transparency. A man whose name rarely appeared in public records, but frequently surfaced in cases where outcomes seemed unusually streamlined. He had a narrow face, thinning gray hair, and a habit of speaking in measured, almost detached tones that made him sound reasonable even when the situations he handled were anything but. Alex didn't trust him, which meant he was worth watching. But none of that mattered if Emily didn't start questioning what was happening to her. He couldn't step in directly, not yet. If he did, Daniel would shift, adapt, disappear if necessary, and whatever network was behind him would close ranks before Alex could expose it. No, Emily had to reach that point herself. She had to see enough to stop cooperating, to stop trusting blindly, to create resistance from within the situation. That was the only way this worked. Alex picked up his phone again, scrolling to the message he had sent the night before. He hadn't expected her to believe it. That wasn't the goal. The goal was doubt, just enough to disrupt the pattern. You're not sick, you're being poisoned. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. He stared at the screen for a moment longer, then locked the phone, setting it aside as he turned back to the monitors in front of him. Emily Parker was no longer just a name in a file. She was the variable that could either confirm everything he had suspected or disappear before he had the chance to prove it. And Alex Carter had no intention of letting history repeat itself. Not this time. Emily didn't transform overnight into someone fearless or decisive, not after everything she had discovered, because the truth didn't replace her fear. It lived beside it, growing in the same space, forcing her to question every thought, every action, every moment that used to feel certain. The apartment felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because she had started noticing things she used to ignore. The way Daniel moved in the kitchen, the way he reached for things without hesitation, the quiet efficiency in his habits that once felt comforting but now felt deliberate. She stood near the counter one morning, watching him prepare coffee, her arms folded loosely as if she were relaxed, but her eyes sharper than before, tracking every motion without letting it show. And for a second, just a second, she wondered if she had imagined everything, if this was what paranoia felt like, if she was turning into exactly what the doctors had warned her about. Daniel Reed didn't look different. That was the hardest part. He was still composed, still patient, still the same man who had held her hand through every collapse, his presence as steady as ever, his voice calm when he asked if she was feeling better that morning. Up close, nothing about him matched the image her mind was trying to construct. No flicker of guilt, no hesitation, no sign that anything was out of place. And that made Emily's doubt turn inward again, sharper this time, more dangerous. "You didn't sleep well again," he observed gently, his tone carrying just enough concern to feel real, and Emily forced a small smile, nodding as she stepped closer, accepting the cup he handed her, the warmth of it grounding her even as her thoughts spiraled. She hesitated for the briefest moment before taking a sip, the pause so small it could have been nothing, and yet to her, it felt like everything. The taste was normal, bitter, slightly strong, exactly how she always liked it. She swallowed anyway, and immediately hated herself for questioning it. That was the problem. Not just the possibility that something was wrong, but the fact that she no longer knew when she was being rational and when she was falling apart. Every action now carried two meanings, one logical, one terrifying. If she checked her drink, she was cautious. If she didn't, she was careless. If she trusted Daniel, she was stable. If she doubted him, she was losing control. There was no safe ground anymore, only shifting interpretations that left her more exhausted than the symptoms themselves. Later that day, when Daniel stepped out for a meeting, Emily moved quickly, the hesitation gone the moment she was alone, replaced by a quiet urgency she hadn't felt before. She went straight to the kitchen, her movements precise, controlled, opening cabinets, checking containers, scanning labels as if something might reveal itself if she looked closely enough. Everything appeared normal, sealed, organized, untouched, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was looking for wouldn't be obvious, wouldn't be careless, wouldn't give itself away so easily. Her gaze settled briefly on a small glass vial tucked behind a row of supplements, barely noticeable unless you were looking for something out of place, and her breath caught as she reached for it, her fingers closing around it with a tension that made her pulse spike. It was empty. Or at least it appeared to be. She held it up to the light, turning it slightly, searching for residue, for anything that would confirm what she was afraid to believe, but there was nothing visible, nothing concrete, just the weight of possibilities sitting in her hand. "This doesn't prove anything," she whispered, her voice low, almost steady, as if saying it out loud could pull her back toward reason, but the fact that she had found it at all was enough to keep her from letting it go completely. She placed it back exactly where it had been, her movements careful, deliberate, recreating the scene as if she had never touched it. Because she understood now, instinctively, that if Daniel was capable of what she feared, then any mistake on her part could change everything. And she wasn't ready for that, not yet. In the days that followed, Emily began to live in two versions of reality at once, one where she functioned normally, spoke calmly, responded the way she always had, and another where every detail mattered, every pattern was observed, every inconsistency noted and stored away. She started writing again, but differently this time, not just documenting what she remembered, but comparing it, cross-referencing times, actions, physical reactions, building something that felt less like a journal and more like evidence. Sometimes, reading it back made her feel grounded. Other times, it made her feel like she was watching herself unravel in slow motion. Meanwhile, across the city, Alex Carter was doing the same thing, only from the outside. He sat in his office again, the monitors now filled with more data than before, financial movements layered over communication records, legal connections mapped out in a network that was beginning to show its true shape. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that Daniel wasn't operating in isolation. There were accounts that linked back to holding structures, shell entities that funneled assets in controlled increments, all designed to avoid attention while maintaining control. Alex leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he traced a transaction that connected Daniel to a firm he hadn't initially prioritized. The name appeared again: Richard Hale. Alex exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the desk as he pulled up Hale's file, reviewing the patterns with renewed focus. Hale wasn't just facilitating legal processes, he was structuring them, shaping outcomes in ways that ensured efficiency, discretion, and most importantly, silence. That kind of consistency didn't come from coincidence, it came from repetition, from practice. Not just one case, Alex muttered, his voice quieter now, more certain. A system. Back in the apartment, Emily was staring at her laptop, her eyes fixed on a series of financial statements she barely recognized, numbers moving in ways that felt wrong, even if she couldn't immediately explain why. There were transfers she didn't remember approving, adjustments that had been processed under her authority but outside her awareness, subtle shifts that on their own meant nothing, but together suggested something much larger. Her chest tightened again. Not panic this time. Clarity. Not complete, not stable, but enough. She leaned back slowly, her mind connecting pieces she hadn't fully understood before. The memory gaps, the documents, the pattern of control, the way decisions had been slowly moving away from her without confrontation, without resistance. It was happening. Quietly. Efficiently. Just like Laura. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing steadying as she forced herself to stay grounded, because this wasn't the moment to break. This was the moment to understand. Across the city, Alex leaned back in his chair at the exact same time, his gaze fixed on the web of connections in front of him, the structure now undeniable. Two people, two perspectives, one truth. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Daniel Reed still believed he was in control. The conference room felt too bright, too polished, too controlled, as if every detail had been designed to remove uncertainty. And yet, uncertainty was the only thing Emily Parker could feel as she stepped inside, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor, while her mind struggled to keep pace with reality. The long table stretched across the room, lined with neatly arranged documents, glasses of water placed with precision, and a group of individuals already seated, their expressions composed, professional, detached in a way that suggested they were here to witness a process, not question it. At the far end stood Daniel Reed, calm as always, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakably dominant, the kind of quiet authority that didn't demand attention yet controlled the room effortlessly. Emily paused for a fraction of a second at the doorway, her gaze sweeping across the people gathered before settling briefly on a man she didn't recognize immediately, though something about him felt deliberate, placed, like a piece of a structure she hadn't fully seen before. Richard Hale. He stood near the documents, his tall, narrow frame slightly hunched as if he had spent years leaning over contracts and legal texts, his thinning gray hair combed neatly back, and his pale, almost expressionless face carrying the kind of neutrality that wasn't natural, it was practiced. His eyes, small and calculating behind thin-framed glasses, flicked toward Emily for only a moment before returning to the papers, but that brief glance was enough to make her feel assessed, measured, and quietly categorized. "Emily," Daniel said gently, stepping toward her, his voice low and reassuring, the same tone he had used every time she felt uncertain, every time she needed something to hold on to. He reached her with unhurried confidence, placing a hand lightly at the small of her back, guiding her forward just enough to suggest support, not pressure, and yet the movement left no room for hesitation. You don't have to worry. This is just a formality." His words were soft, almost intimate, but the room itself contradicted them. The presence of witnesses, the arrangement of documents, the quiet readiness of everything suggesting that this moment had been prepared long before she had arrived. Emily nodded slowly, though the motion felt disconnected from her own intention, like her body was performing a role her mind hadn't fully agreed to. She moved toward the chair, her steps measured, careful, each one grounded in effort rather than instinct. And as she sat, the weight of the moment settled around her in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. The documents were placed directly in front of her, crisp, organized, structured in the same clean language she had seen before, language that sounded reasonable, protective, necessary, until you looked at it long enough to understand what it truly meant. Temporary transfer of authority, protective legal oversight, financial guardianship. The words blurred for a second before sharpening again, her eyes scanning them automatically, her mind processing them in fragments rather than meaning, and somewhere in that space between understanding and denial, something inside her began to fracture. "You just need time to recover," Daniel continued, his voice steady, his hand now resting lightly on the back of her chair, grounding, present, constant. "This ensures everything stays stable while you focus on getting better." He spoke like someone explaining something simple, something obvious, something that required no resistance, and for a moment, just a moment, Emily wanted to believe him completely, because believing him was easier than confronting the alternative. But then Laura's face appeared in her mind, not as a memory she owned, but as an image she had seen, studied, understood. The same quiet fragility, the same controlled descent, the same documents. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, her breath catching in a way she couldn't fully control as the two realities collided inside her. One built on trust, the other on pattern, and neither one willing to give way. "Are you comfortable proceeding?" Richard Hale's voice cut through the room, calm, measured, professional, carrying just enough authority to move things forward without appearing forceful. He didn't look directly at her when he spoke, his attention still partially on the documents, as if her answer was expected, not required. Emily looked down at the pen placed beside the papers. It was simple, black, unremarkable. And yet, in that moment, it felt heavier than anything she had ever held. Her hand moved toward it slowly, not out of certainty, but because the absence of movement felt impossible under the weight of expectation surrounding her. Her fingers wrapped around the pen, the cool surface grounding her for a brief second before the tremor started, subtle at first, then more noticeable, the physical manifestation of everything she couldn't resolve inside her own mind. If she was wrong, if this was all in her head, then this moment, this hesitation, this doubt would destroy everything. Daniel would see it, the people in the room would see it, and she would confirm what the doctors had suggested, that she was no longer reliable, that she was losing control. But if she was right, if even a fraction of what she suspected was true, then this wasn't a signature, it was surrender. Emily's grip tightened slightly around the pen as her thoughts spiraled, faster now, louder, pulling her in opposite directions with equal force. Her heart was racing, her breathing shallow, the edges of the room blurring just enough to remind her how fragile her state had become, how easy it would be for everything to tilt just slightly out of balance. "Take your time," Daniel said softly, leaning closer, his voice now quieter, more personal, as if the rest of the room had disappeared, as if this moment existed only between the two of them. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed in her mind, colliding with the message she couldn't forget. "You're not sick. You're being poisoned." Emily's vision narrowed for a second, not from weakness, but from focus, from the sudden clarity that cut through the noise just enough to leave one question standing above everything else. "Who do I trust?" Her hand hovered over the paper, the tip of the pen just above the line where her name was meant to go, the distance between action and hesitation so small it could have been nothing, and yet it contained everything. Her reflection faintly appeared in the polished surface of the table, distorted slightly, unfamiliar in a way that made her pause. "Am I still me?" Or am I becoming her? Laura. The room was silent now, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because the moment itself demanded it. Every person present waiting, watching, expecting resolution without understanding the weight of what they were witnessing. Emily inhaled slowly, held it, and for the first time since this had begun, she didn't look at Daniel, she looked at herself. And in that single, fragile second, she understood something that had been buried beneath fear, beneath doubt, beneath everything she had been told to believe. This was not about being right. This was not about being wrong. This was about whether she was willing to disappear quietly, or risk everything to remain herself. The pen trembled slightly, then lowered, and the world seemed to stop. The pen hovered just above the paper, its tip trembling in a moment stretched so thin it felt like it might snap, when the sound of the door opening cut through the silence with a precision that no one in the room had prepared for. And Emily Parker's hand froze mid-air as every instinct inside her shifted at once, not in panic, but in awareness. The room turned, not abruptly, not chaotically, but with a quiet, collective attention, as the man who stepped inside did so without hesitation, without apology, and without asking for permission, as if he had already decided that this moment belonged to him long before anyone else had arrived. Alex Carter didn't look at Emily. Not at first. His gaze moved directly to Daniel Reed, locking onto him with a focus so steady it felt less like confrontation and more like confirmation, as if he wasn't entering the room to question anything, but to finish something that had already been proven. He walked forward with controlled, measured steps, his tall frame relaxed but deliberate, his dark jacket falling cleanly against his shoulders, and the faint stubble along his jaw catching the light just enough to sharpen the angles of his face, giving him a presence that didn't need to raise its voice to dominate a space. There was no rush in his movements, no visible tension, just a quiet certainty that made everyone else's stillness feel fragile in comparison. "Daniel Reed," Alex said, his voice calm, level, and completely unshaken, carrying across the room without force, yet impossible to ignore. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't an introduction, it was a statement, a placement. Daniel didn't react immediately, and that, more than anything, revealed something. For a brief second, too small for most people to notice, the control in his posture tightened. Not broken, not lost, but adjusted, recalibrated, like a system responding to an unexpected variable. Then the expression returned, composed, measured, the same one Emily had trusted for so long. "I'm not sure this is the right place for whatever this is," Daniel replied smoothly, his tone even, polite, and carefully neutral, as if he were managing a minor inconvenience rather than a direct intrusion. Alex stopped a few steps from the table, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "It's exactly the right place," he said quietly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device and placing it on the table with a soft, deliberate motion that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. Emily's hand was still holding the pen, but she wasn't thinking about the signature anymore. She was watching. The screen lit up. The video began to play. It wasn't dramatic, no music, no angle designed for effect, just a fixed perspective, slightly distant, taken through reflection, subtle enough to go unnoticed unless you knew where to look. The kitchen, her kitchen, the shape of it unmistakable, the placement of objects familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before her mind could catch up. Daniel stood at the counter, calm, unhurried, the same way he always was. His hand moved, just slightly, a small vial, a controlled motion, pouring. Emily's breath caught, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer procedural, no longer expectant. It was absorbing, processing, shifting, as the reality of what was being shown settled into place piece by piece. "That's taken over multiple days," Alex said, his voice steady, not louder, but heavier now, carrying weight instead of explanation. "Different times, same behavior." Daniel exhaled softly, almost amused, shaking his head once as if dismissing something trivial. "That proves nothing," he replied, his tone still controlled, but sharper now, less patient. "You're showing a man preparing a drink in his own home. Alex didn't argue. He didn't need to. He tapped the device once. The screen changed. Documents appeared. Laura Mitchell, medical evaluations, legal transfers, dates aligned, patterns repeated. Emily felt it then, not as a shock, not as a sudden realization, but as a confirmation of something that had already begun forming inside her, something she had been too afraid to name. "This is the same progression," Alex continued, his gaze finally shifting, not to Emily, but to the people seated around the table, the witnesses, the professionals, the ones who had come here to validate a process that no longer looked neutral. Same diagnosis language, same legal pathway, same transfer of control. Richard Hale straightened slightly, his composure holding, but thinner now, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something that was beginning to move beneath him. "These are serious accusations," he said carefully, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer detached. "Without proper context—" "There is context," Alex interrupted, not forcefully but definitively, the kind of interruption that didn't raise conflict, it ended it. He slid another file forward. "Financial records, asset redistribution through shell accounts. Your firm is connected to 3 separate cases with identical structures." Hale didn't reach for the file. That, more than anything, said enough. Emily's grip on the pen loosened. It slipped from her fingers, rolling slightly across the table before coming to rest against the edge of the document she had almost signed. No one picked it up. Daniel's gaze shifted then, not to Alex, to Emily, and for the first time since she had known him, there was something else there, not fear, not guilt, but calculation, a silent assessment of what she knew, what she believed, and what he could still control. "Emily," he said, softer now, stepping closer, his voice returning to that familiar tone, the one that had always reached her when nothing else could. "You don't have to let this confuse you. You know me. You know what we have." And for a moment, just a moment, she almost did, but the moment didn't hold. Because now she had seen what she couldn't unsee, not imagined, not suspected, seen. Emily stood up slowly, her movements steady in a way they hadn't been in days, her breath even, her mind clear. Not because everything made sense, but because one thing finally did. "This isn't confusion," she said quietly, her voice not loud, not shaking, but grounded in something deeper than certainty. It was choice. She looked at Daniel, not the version of him she had loved, not the version she had trusted, but the one standing in front of her now, the one connected to everything she had tried to explain away. And for the first time, she didn't search for reassurance. She didn't look for answers in him. She didn't wait. Emily stepped back. Just one step, but it changed everything. Across the room, Alex watched without expression, not intervening, not guiding, not claiming anything, because this had never been about saving her. It had been about showing her. And now, she could see. The room didn't erupt into chaos the way Emily Parker might have imagined. It shifted, quietly but decisively, like a structure finally giving way after too much pressure had been applied beneath the surface. And as the weight of the evidence settled into the silence, the control Daniel Reed had held so carefully for so long began to fracture in ways that no amount of composure could repair. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. But something in his stillness changed, the precision of his posture no longer effortless, but held together by force, his eyes moving once across the room, calculating, measuring, searching for a way to contain what had already moved beyond him. The first to act wasn't Emily, nor Alex, but one of the senior partners seated along the table, a man named Victor Langley, broad-shouldered, in his early 60s, with silver hair combed back neatly and a face shaped by decades of negotiation and control, his presence carrying a weight that came not from volume, but from certainty. He had been silent until now, his hands folded calmly in front of him, observing everything with a level of patience that suggested he had seen power shift before and understood exactly when to intervene. When he finally stood, the movement was deliberate, final. "This meeting is over," Victor said, his voice firm, measured, leaving no space for disagreement, and for the first time, Daniel didn't respond immediately. Security followed not long after, called quietly, efficiently, the kind of response that suggested systems were already in place for moments like this, even if no one had expected to use them today. Daniel didn't resist when they approached him, but he didn't comply easily either. His expression remained composed, his gaze shifting once more toward Emily, and in that look there was something that lingered, something unresolved, something that no longer held power but hadn't completely disappeared.
"You don't understand what you're stepping into," he said, not as a threat but as a statement, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier softness, revealing something colder beneath. Emily didn't answer, because for the first time, she didn't need to. As Daniel was escorted out, the room exhaled in a way that felt collective, the tension releasing not all at once, but in layers, like something tightly wound finally beginning to loosen. And Emily remained where she stood, not frozen, not uncertain, but grounded in a way she hadn't felt in what now seemed like a very long time. The documents were still on the table. The pen lay where it had rolled, unfinished, unclaimed, and now, irrelevant. In the days that followed, the world didn't stop, but it did change, in ways both immediate and quiet, as the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of control and manipulation began to surface fully, not just within the company, but beyond it. Investigations opened, financial records were re-examined, connections once dismissed as coincidence revealed themselves as structure. Richard Hale's involvement came under scrutiny almost immediately, his carefully maintained distance collapsing under the weight of patterns that could no longer be ignored. And while he didn't disappear, his influence did, retreating into something far less certain than before. Emily returned to the office not as someone reclaiming power, but as someone rediscovering it, step by step, decision by decision, not rushing, not forcing clarity where it hadn't fully formed yet, but trusting something she had almost lost, the ability to recognize her own voice. The first few days were the hardest, not because of external pressure, but because of the internal silence that followed everything she had gone through, the absence of doubt feeling unfamiliar in a way that made her question even that. But it didn't last, because slowly, consistently, the clarity returned. Not perfect, not complete, but hers. One afternoon, weeks later, Emily found herself standing outside a quiet rehabilitation center on the edge of the city. The building modest, understated, far removed from the polished environments she had spent most of her life in. And for a moment, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition of what this moment meant. Laura Mitchell was inside, the woman whose story had almost become her own. When Emily finally stepped through the doors, she was greeted by a nurse named Hannah Cole, a woman in her early 40s with soft features and tired eyes that carried the weight of long shifts and quiet resilience. Her posture slightly slouched from years of work that demanded more patience than recognition. Hannah spoke gently, her voice calm in a way that didn't feel practiced but lived in, as she guided Emily through the hallway. "She's doing better," Hannah said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Slowly, but she's there." Laura sat by the window when Emily entered the room, her posture still slightly withdrawn, her blonde hair shorter now, uneven in places, her frame thinner than in the photograph Emily had first seen, but her eyes, those same gray-blue eyes, were clearer, more present, as if something that had been dimmed was beginning to return. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because some things didn't require explanation. Emily stepped closer, her movement steady, and when Laura finally looked up, there was no confusion in her gaze, only recognition, not of Emily specifically, but of what she represented. "I remember more now," Laura said quietly, her voice soft but grounded, as if each word had to travel a longer distance before it reached the surface. Emily nodded. "That's enough," she replied gently. And it was. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because everything was resolved, not because the past had been undone, but because the weight of it was no longer something she carried alone. Alex Carter was waiting near the edge of the parking lot, leaning lightly against his car, his posture relaxed,
his expression unreadable in the way it always seemed to be when everything had already been decided. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. Emily walked toward him instead, stopping just a few steps away, the silence between them not uncomfortable but complete. "You could have told me everything," she said after a moment, her voice calm, not accusing, not questioning, just acknowledging. Alex shook his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It wouldn't have mattered," he replied. Emily studied him for a second, understanding settling into place without resistance. "You needed to see it yourself." He didn't answer. Because she was right, there was nothing left to explain. Alex pushed himself off the car, opening the door with a quiet ease that matched everything about him, and before he got in, he paused just long enough to say one last thing. "You didn't need someone to save you," he said, his voice steady, certain. "You just needed to not give up on yourself." Then he left. No hesitation, no expectation, just gone. Emily stood there for a while after, watching the space where he had been, not with loss, but with something quieter, something that felt closer to understanding than anything else. Because in the end, this had never been about him. It had never been about Daniel. It had never even been about Laura. It had been about her. And as she turned back toward the city, toward the life she was no longer afraid to reclaim, she realized something that settled deeper than relief, deeper than victory. She had never truly disappeared. She had only come close to forgetting who she was. And now, she wouldn't again.
In the end, Emily's story is not just about betrayal or survival. It's about rediscovering the quiet strength that lives within all of us. There are moments in life when everything feels uncertain, when doubt becomes louder than truth, and when even our own minds seem like strangers. But sometimes, the miracle isn't someone saving us. It's the moment we choose not to give up on ourselves. Maybe God doesn't always remove the storm right away, but He gives us the clarity, the courage, and the right people at the right time to find our way through it. And just like Emily, you may feel lost for a while, but that doesn't mean you are gone. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might help someone else feel less alone. Like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. May God bless you, guide you, and protect you in every step of your journey.